Games have the potential of telling amazing stories because, as opposed to other mediums like movies or books, the player is able to interact with the world and make decisions. In some cases, these choices affect the story of the game you're playing. However, I think most people don't realize how powerful the player's immersive experience can be, and as a result, leave a lot of potential on the table. They fall back on tactics like relying on cutscenes. As the player progresses, they pause to show you clips of narrative instead of allowing the player to experience it through action, which leads to a less impactful story. Naturally, this also feels less immersive and can even impact your retention rate. Before starting the video, I want to remind you to smash the like button and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy this kind of content. Today, we're going to discuss a few games that do an excellent job at telling stories through gameplay. Please bear in mind, this is not restricted to video games. Surprisingly and important for newer folks to game design, this can also happen in board games. When people think about telling stories, they think about emotions and strong or impactful stories, but the truth is that this doesn't need to be an emotional roller coaster. As a matter of fact, you can convey narrative through gameplay. One classic example of this is the board game Monopoly. In this millionaire story, you see how after going around the board a couple of times, the mechanics allow for the player to feel themselves getting wealthier and more powerful. You get to build houses, hotels, and charge a good amount of money for people who end up falling on our properties. They also get a feel of having to pay very high taxes for doing so, and get the occasional jail card because they did something wrong. Another example of conveying a narrative is the game of chess. If you think about it, the whole point of the game is that you're leading an army in order to conquer your opponent. Every move you make is a strategic battle between two empires. Some people don't think about this, since there are so many rules and things to consider, but the point of the game is to see that battle evolve and have players feel empowered. They have to be sharp and very quick thinkers to command their troops and ultimately beat their opponent. As you can probably tell by now, this is yet another subjective area of game design. Many games have tried to tell their story through gameplay. This is a huge challenge, since it is very complicated to be able to convey narrative effectively, so I want to share a few games that are incredible examples of how to communicate narrative and create a more immersive game for players to get lost in. The Last of Us is an excellent example of subverting expectations through game mechanics. You might argue that this game is cluttered with cutscenes and the mechanics that don't necessarily tell the narrative. However, there is one brilliant moment where they subvert your expectations, when Joel, the main character, prepares to boost Ellie to an unreachable area close to the end of the game. This mechanic works the same way through the entire game. A player usually expects to have Joel crouch and for Ellie to approach him and climb up as she has been doing every single time. However, something is different about this moment. When Joel gets into position, he waits longer than usual, only to realize Ellie isn't moving. This is a great way of communicating she is troubled, feeling down or depressed, and makes you feel a little step back to look around and see what's happening. This helps subvert player expectations as well as communicating non-verbally to the player how she really feels and capitalizes on the power of that emotional connection. Another game that tells a story through mechanics is Celeste. If you take it at face value, you will never guess that about this game. It is known to be a complex game for the skilled players who like a challenge. However, they do something really clever with their mechanics. Essentially, the main character has depression, so she has another self who always brings her down and insults her. As the story builds, Madeline confronts her fear and becomes one with her second self. When this happens, the player unlocks an ability to do a double jump. This not only makes the levels more interesting, but also provides the player with a sense that now she is equipped to make it to the top of the mountain. As for the mountain, this is a representation of her depression. Madeline has to go through different obstacles and endure hardships in previous levels. She has to try and try again until finally you reach the top, making this the most empowering and pivotal moment of the story. RPG games can also accomplish storytelling through mechanics. Persona 5 is my favorite example, because in this game, they use unique concepts for narrative purposes. The levels of this game are dungeons called palaces. Each one represents the cognition or mental representation of the people whose heart you're stealing. As you traverse each of these palaces, they tell the story of that specific character through game mechanics to convey what their distorted desire is. For example, one of them is a bank palace for a drug trafficker who covets money. Another is a museum for an artist who likes to plagiarize his students. However, the environments aren't the only part that represents the narrative. You also have the opportunity to navigate the space in different ways and solve different puzzles in each palace based on the theme. For me, thinking about narrative in the beginning was very overwhelming until I saw a game called Passage. Honestly, I think it's probably the best example you'll ever find. This game is simple in art style, as well as mechanics. All you do throughout the game is move from left to right. As you advance, you can choose different paths to evade obstacles, but all you really do is walk around. The entire game is only 5 minutes of playtime, yet in those few minutes, it tells the story of life in a very short experience. The creator uses the metaphor that you can only move forward in life and makes it a literal game. It's brilliant. Speaking of emotions, the next example is a pretty powerful one, Shadow of the Colossus. This is also a great game, not only because of its great mechanics at the time, but also because of its story. It is the only game that has made me feel guilty of playing it, and it is one of the greatest moments in gaming for me. In this game, you start taking out creatures called Colossi in order to be able to revive your loved one. However, you don't know anything about these creatures. They seem to be giant creatures wandering the world. The interesting part is that they never attack you or look evil, so that makes them even harder to kill. Regardless, you need to keep going, so you take them out in order for the game to progress. As you get deeper into the game, you start questioning whether what you're doing is selfish or bad. Surely enough, as a player, you start seeing the consequences of your actions. The main character's appearance starts changing and looking worse as you go forward. By the end, you realize why you did what you did and the full extent of the consequences of your actions in a very powerful and gut-wrenching moment. Another game by the same developer is Echo, one of the most emotional games of all time. The way they tell the story with a lot of cutscenes or dialogue is that the main character is able to grab Yorda's hand whenever they want. This creates a sense of connection between the player and Yorda, which makes the player care for her. As a player, you guide her to safety through the entire game. The more you spend time with her, the more your bond grows. On the topic of growing a bond, Journey is another game that felt different from all the others I have played before. In this game, you don't die like you would in others. It's more of a meditative experience where they did a great job at telling a story through mechanics. In fact, they take it a step further by asking the player to interpret what they felt throughout the game. They make you question what the meaning of everything was by leaving the story as an interactive experience with no dialogues. Some people say it's a metaphor about life, while others might think it's about forging relationships. The interesting thing is that in this game, the story is told by the interaction of the player with their partner on their way to the mountain, the game's only objective. And that's it, you guys. Thank you so much for watching. What other games do you think tell the story through mechanics? Please let me know in the comment section below. Also, if you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. See you next time!